Hi everyone, my name is Jody Sandfort and I'm a professor of public affairs here at the University of Minnesota. And I was asked by the IRL leadership team to talk with you today about developmental evaluation, in part because it's a really nice complement to some of the partnership work that you're doing in communities that's trying to focus on improving health outcomes and how research is useful. This particular approach to evaluation was talked about in another material where a grant maker from LISC was talking about the creative placemaking work that they've done. And so in this lecture, I want to focus on 4 things. I want to provide a quick overview to you about developmental evaluation, offer an example of my own practice where we've used it to good end, talk a bit about the principles of this approach because it's very important, like any methodology, that you implement with fidelity, and then in the end, just hopefully spark your interest so that you can learn more from some great resources that I've provided and think about whether or not this approach to evaluation can be useful to you in the years ahead in your projects. So to begin, what is developmental evaluation? What's interesting to me about it is that it's a way to systematically gather data to support the development of an innovation. So in that, you're trying to systematically and consistently gather real-time information as people are trying to innovate, make changes in complex environments to a program as it's unfolding. It emphasizes real-time feedback, and the key principle is that it's designed in a way so that the users of the evaluation are using this feedback to alter what they're doing, make sense of their programming as it evolves, think about the implications, and really focus on real-time decision-making to assure that the project as implemented actually is what is creating the results that are desired. And finally, the design that's used in this approach to evaluation is emergent, and so it will change and evolve as the innovator and the evaluator come to understand more clearly what's actually being done. This little cartoon is a great way to talk about why this approach to evaluation has been developed in the last 5 and 6 years. In contrast to a process evaluation, where you're looking at the degree to which what is being implemented adheres to the process as it was planned, or an impact evaluation or an outcome evaluation when you're trying to ascertain the impact of a program, developmental evaluation is really taking kind of seriously this cartoon, which is when you start something that's innovative, you don't really know where you're going to go. And rather than trying to say we're going to make up some outcomes or make up some activities and we're going to judge you according to that, developmental evaluation says we can do it a better way. A visual that I think is helpful is that in traditional evaluation, we think oftentimes that there's a start and a finish, and that particularly in outcome evaluation, you're going to be judged on whether or not you achieved that target. Whereas in developmental evaluation, we realize that people fail along the way. They learn things, it evolves, and part of what evaluation can do is to provide systematic information to help the leaders and the innovators be more effective as they're moving towards the desired state. In part, I became interested in this evaluation approach because myself, I do a lot of innovation. I spent some time as a funder, and I realized that sometimes people use evaluation just symbolically. Everybody knows that rarely is there a start and a finish. That is an iterative process, but we hadn't been providing that kind of approach as evaluators. Another visual that I think is helpful, and it relates to something that Mina Silberberger talked about in her lectures on evaluation. She talked about that there's some thorny issues. And I think part of what's thorny about evaluation often is that when you write a proposal, you articulate an intended strategy as shown on this visual. It's logical, it's linear, it connects to what we do to raise money to fund our projects. There's always part of that that's unrealized, that when you get into the project, you realize it wasn't what you thought when you wrote the proposal. There's the deliberate strategy that you also implement. But then there's this important thing called the emergent strategy. And as you're working in a community, you realize that there were some needs you hadn't anticipated, or some leaders or nonprofits that have a different dimension than what you had expected. And so your realized strategy is often quite different than what you intend. In conventional evaluation, those thorny issues come in trying to deal with that change. And what developmental evaluation does is it provides you a way to be accounting for what is emergent and really evaluating the realized strategy, the thing you're actually doing in practice. In the LISC video, the program officer talked about the importance of having some outsider eyes to help inform their creative placemaking work. And that's really, this outsider eyes can give permission to say, you know what, there's something emerging there that you should take advantage of, and don't be held up because it wasn't in the plan that you crafted 6 or 9 months ago. So now to my second point, an example of where we've used this approach to evaluation. A year and a half ago, my team at the Future Services Institute was brought in to work with Olmsted County. They were building a permanent supportive housing project for teenagers and young parents and who had been previously homeless. And it was a partnership between the county and some nonprofits. And they wanted to utilize a housing first and harm reduction type of intervention model. And they had done all this work to create this beautiful facility. And we were brought in because as that facility got built, the program people realized that they needed some help to really develop the programming that was very responsive to the needs of these people who had been homeless for many years of their lives. And so providing a home was one step, but you also needed to build social cohesion, get the children into early childhood, etc. So what we did is we crafted an evaluation design over a 1-year period that had systematic interviews being done by some of the leaders in what we call the core team of the evaluation project. We did interviews with frontline staff at the facility and residents, again, 4 times during the year. And how we presented that information was on progress reports. So on the one on the screen, you can see that we talk in these progress reports about the successes and the challenges. And what we're really trying to do is facilitate the image you see on the right-hand part of the screen, where people are planning, they're acting, and they're assessing. This is not a linear process. It really is. When they decided in this particular facility to launch a program for young children in the facility at night to kind of give respite care to their families, they implemented it. We gave them some immediate feedback about the residents' response to that, and it allowed them to adjust the hours, adjust the intensity and the activities that the kids were being exposed to. And there were many examples like that where, because we could gather just-in-time feedback, they weren't just depending on the hunches of the program staff, but much more systematically collected information. And that evaluation design changed over time because staff changed, programming ideas came and went. And it was very important for us to be connected to what those program leaders thought that they were doing. So the third part of this lecture that I wanted to emphasize is, if you're interested in this approach to evaluation, it's really important that you stop and think about whether or not its core characteristics align with the context within which you find yourself. So it's very important that any developmental evaluation has fidelity to the principles that are articulated on this slide. This was developed by Michael Quinn Patton, who is an evaluator that's kind of given the first articulation to this approach, and it's been utilized by many people around the world. But the most important first principle is that if you're going to use this approach, the initiative itself and the leaders of the initiative must be focused on getting evaluation input to fuel their ongoing understanding about their purpose, to support real innovation, And this is really often when you're trying to do something new that hasn't been done in that place before, or perhaps replicate an idea that's been tried in other places but not in that context. But the focus of the leaders is really on innovation and change. Second of all, it's critical to have rigor, to have the evaluator be in a place where they're asking evaluative questions, where they're pushing leaders to think analytically, question their assumptions, and really be pretty rigorous and just-in-time feedback and not just doing it symbolically. Third of all, the initiative, this methodology is very much utilization focused. And so the evaluator and the innovator work hand in hand in trying to figure out both what information to collect and how to provide it in a meaningful way. So in the example I just provided, we ended up doing these interim reports about every 6 weeks in a newsletter format. They were colorful, they were vibrant, they talked about the successes and the challenges, but in ways then that the program managers could share with the frontline staff to help them get a sense about what's going on with this evaluation and how can we tweak our practices in light of what we're learning. Developmental evaluation is really useful when you're trying to do innovation, when you don't know what the activities are going to be, and it is more in this interaction between adaptive and technical kinds of challenges. It assumes that there's complexity and a complex system underlying the activities, and so if you can say ahead of time how you do X and Y will happen when there's clear linear cause and effect, developmental evaluation isn't really needed. But if you think of it's more complex, or there's a lot of systems and systems dynamics where unexpected things could emerge from any corner, this rapid cycle approach to evaluation is very useful. It requires that the evaluator be really partnering with the innovator and co-creating the design and the reports and things, and that everybody is committed to using the timely feedback that's generated from this kind of methodology. So again, it's a really nice approach, I think, if you realize that you are grappling with both technical and adaptive problems in the implementation of the project. So finally, I wanted to be really just explicit that like any approach to evaluation, developmental evaluation uses a range of methods for data collection, interviews, observations, activity logs, photographs, spatial information, administrative data. The analytical approach is often descriptive, but you can use an approach called outcome mapping where you're really trying to look at the development of the project in relation to desired outcomes. And when people share evaluation results, they don't just think of them as coming in these big analytical reports. So as I suggested in the evaluation that I mentioned a moment ago, we used newsletters because that was a methodology that was much more aligned with the utilization orientation that we had. We really wanted people on the ground to use the evaluation as we went. So hopefully, this has sparked your interest in learning more about developmental evaluation. As I suggested, there are some resources that have been provided to you, and there's an emerging literature about this approach. I think it's really an interesting thing for you as the IRL group to think about because it's very aligned with the kind of partnership that seems to me to be at the core of what you're doing, where you want to support the development of new solutions, that the complex environments are very changeable, that you're interested in real-time feedback, and that people really want to utilize the research and evaluation that's coming out. So if everybody can get around the same page and recognize that the emergence is actually what you want, developmental evaluation is a useful tool to being able to support a deeper kind of learning from evaluation as it goes.